Thanks, Jonathan and Nicolas, for inviting me. First, some of my conflicts of interest that are relevant for my talk. I'm part of Equator of the Cochrane collaboration. A rapid outline. I will first give you some example of meta-research that we are doing. I will talk about interventional research on research, and I will make some comments on how improving on bad research practices without contributing to the forces of anti-science. First, examples of meta-research. We work on the evolution of poor reporting on inadequate methods over time using 20,000 randomized control trials from 22,000 Cochrane reviews published in more than 3,000 journals. And we use the proportion of trials considered by the review authors to be at high or unclear risk of bias as surrogate measures of inadequate methods or of poor reporting, respectively. We focused on several key items of the Cochrane risk of bias tool: sequence generation, allocation concealment, blinding of participant and personnel, blinding of outcome assessors, and incomplete outcome data, because they are associated with intervention effect estimates in meta-epidemiological studies. And as you could see, there is probably for each of these items around 40% of trials that are at low risk of bias. All the others are unclear risk of bias if they are poorly reported or at high risk of bias. If we look over time, and you could see this slide based on the journal impact factor, you could see that there is an improvement over time, for example, for allocation concealment, and that the better the impact factors, probably the lower the risk of bias for these items, that is allocation concealment. It's not so clear for incomplete outcome data. Another example is the fragility of the conclusion of meta-analysis. The fragility index has been defined to measure the confidence we have on the randomized control trial conclusion. It has been proposed by Canadian authors. And for randomized control trials showing statistically significant results, the fragility index corresponds to the minimal number of patients whose status would have to change from a non-event to an event in order to turn the result to statistically not significant. It has been published by Walsh and colleagues in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. And for we extended this concept for meta-analysis, and we defined the fragility index as the minimum number of patients from one or more trials included in the meta-analysis for which a modification of the event status, for example, flipping an event to non-event or a non-event to event, will change the statistical significance of the pooled treatment effect. It's a little bit more complex than for randomized control trial, and we have developed a method to estimate the fragility index to find specific trials on event status modifications that could change the conclusion with the smallest number of modifications. Basically, we first make a single event status modification in each arm of each trial in turn. We then select the modification leading to the 95% confidence interval closer to 1 as a starting point for the next iteration, and we make iteration, and the number of iteration is the fragility index of the meta-analysis. And here you could see the distribution of a sample of 900 Cochrane meta-analysis according to fragility index, and as you could see, more than 30% of meta-analysis have a fragility index less than or equal to 5. And if I take these two examples, first, most of the trials, including in systematic review of Cochrane reviews, are at high risk or unclear risk of bias. Second, the fragility of Cochrane reviews is very high. Some people could say that I undermine the credibility of Cochrane. But in fact, I am working to improve the quality of the next trial and improve the quality of next systematic review on Cochrane reviews. Second point, interventional research on research. There is, according to a paper from John Ioannidis, more than 2,000 meta-research related publications each year, but there is only a handful of interventions in this field. And I think that it's important to develop intervention to improve research practices and evaluate them through robust designs, and mainly through randomized controlled trials. And we try to rethink research dissemination through interventional research on research. We develop pragmatic, low burden and low cost intervention to improve clinical research and use innovative study designs or modeling to evaluate these interventions. And we have performed trials with more than 2,500 participants that could be investigators of trials, clinicians, patients, or students. And we try to work on all the different questions we could have to decrease the waste in research. We need to have a question that is relevant. We need to have a good study planning and conduct to control the risk of bias. We need to have access to the study results. We need to have transparent reporting, and we need to interpret fairly the results. And we use for that variety of study design, randomized trial, cohort-embedded randomized control trial, and split manuscript design. And we have performed trials at different points of this wheel. For example, we have performed trials for increasing the posting of results in trial registries. We have performed trials to increase the implementation of reporting guidelines. We have performed trials for exploring some modification of abstract reporting, and we have performed trials to validate the concept of spin. Here is an example about reporting guidelines. We try to rethink reporting guidelines. You know that there is reporting guidelines for randomized control trials, the consort statement. There is also a lot of extension of the consort statement, probably more than 10. And the consort statement is endorsed by several journal editors. There is it's mentioned in the instruction to authors. But despite that, incomplete reporting is frequent. And 75% of randomized control trials, including Cochrane reviews, did not report information to assess risk of bias. And it's a kind of failure of reporting guidelines, and our hypothesis is that the format of these reporting guidelines is not the good one. We are convinced that most authors are unable to understand all items as described in the consort checklist. The wording of these items is not always easy to understand by untrained users, the authors. Most authors will never search what should be reported for each item from the consort E&E papers. It's very big papers that are 6 to 35 pages of journals, and it's more or less impossible for authors to search for all the items, the significance of the items. We think also that the timing of the reporting guidelines is not the good one. The consort checklist is frequently implemented just before submission or during the peer review process, and it's probably too late in the life of a manuscript. And therefore, we want to rethink the implementation of reporting guidelines. We want to change the timing, and we want to develop intervention dedicated to authors when they are writing the first draft of their manuscript. We want to change the format. We want to expand on tailored checklists with explicit information for each item, with bullet points explaining the expected content of each item. And we have developed for that a writing aid tool. And the idea of this writing aid tool is to expand, combine, and tailor checklists. And therefore, rather than, for example, the item 6 of the checklist that is completely defined pre-specified primary and secondary output measures, including how and when they were assessed, we give some details about what must be reported. And we have performed a randomized control trial to test this hypothesis. We use for this trial protocols from the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of Clinical Oncology. And we have performed what we call split manuscript randomized control trials with blinded outcome assessment. And 41 students, master and PhD students in epidemiology, participate to this work. And they have 4 hours to write the section, the method section of this trial. They have the protocol and they have to write the method section. And for 3 sections, they have access to the writing aid tool, and for 3 sections, they don't have access to the writing aid tool. And there is a section about trial design, a section about randomization, a section about blinding, participants, intervention, and outcomes. And the completeness of reporting was assessed by 2 blinded independent assessors. And what we could see is that there was a quite clear difference between the section of the manuscript written by participants with no writing aid tool and with writing aid tool. And there was also a big difference between the completeness of reporting of the manuscript written with the writing aid tool and the completeness of the published report in the New England Journal of Clinical Oncology. In fact, students were able to do a better job for writing this method section than the published report in the New England. Therefore, based on that, on this previous trial, COBWEB, but also another trial that is called Web Consort, we propose to move from usual consort checklist on E&E papers to expanded checklist, including bullet points, from consort checklist to consort-based writing aid tools, and from multiple consort extension to a series of reporting guidelines for the main types of randomized control trials, including their design and intervention. For example, we want to have to combine the main consort and the consort extension that are relevant for some specific randomized control trials. For example, a cluster randomized control trial assessing non-pharmacological treatment, and to have only 1 checklist for such type of trial. And our aim is to cover approximately 80% of published randomized control trials. And this tool will be currently already available and will be on the Equator website in the next few months. My view is that we need more interventional research on research to move from problems to solutions, to make decisions based on evidence rather than on beliefs and habits, to optimize the resources, for example, the reviewer time or the statistician time, to improve the global research enterprise and the confidence in research, and to decrease the waste or improve the return on investment of the money spent in research. Here is an example about interventional research on peer review. Over the last 30 years, there was only 22 randomized controlled trials dedicated to peer review. And among these 22 trials, only 1 was a multi-journal randomized controlled trials. And I take the example of the trials in the cancer community for children, the pediatric cancer community as an example. In this community, it's clear that the ambition to include all patients in a clinical trial has been pioneered by the pediatric cancer community. And historically, as many as 80% of children have been enrolled into trials. And this high enrollment is believed to have been a major factor contributing to improvement in survival for childhood cancer, which have increased from about 40% in the 70s to more than 80%. And I think that we need exactly the same for peer review. We need to convince at least some journals to enter in a continuous process of peer review innovation and improvement, to develop multi-journals, if not multi-publishers, randomized control trials to evaluate some intervention and to ensure their generalizability. And it would be nice if we could obtain that a teeny fraction, perhaps 1% of manuscript, will be included in randomized control trial dedicated to assess the impact of peer review innovation. I think that we could also imagine to develop a culture of continuous improvement of clinical research for a specific disease. I am currently developing what we call living network meta-analysis. The idea is to have a network meta-analysis for all treatments available for a specific disease, to improve evidence synthesis and to have an updated evidence synthesis. But we could also use exactly the same for providing the networks of existing and ongoing trials to help the planning of future trials, to have a living monitoring of trials conducting quality. For example, we could compare the outcome used versus the core outcome sets that have been proposed by COMET. We could also work on avoidable waste. The most frequent methodological errors in previous randomized control trials. We could also monitor the transparency of these trials, the quality of reporting, the data sharing, and we could disclose the quality and transparency results by funders, journals, and university, with the idea to have a learning clinical research system. How improving on bad research practices without contributing to the forces of anti-science is a very difficult point, I think, and I have very few ideas. I tried to ask some questions. Is stopping doing meta-research will decrease anti-science sentiment? I don't think so. Anti-science largely pre-existed to meta-research work, and not doing meta-research will not help prevent the outrageous excesses of merchant of doubts. Must the anti-science makers stop criticizing bad science? Even if discrediting science is a classic anti-science tactic, critical thinking is the foundation of science and is necessary to improve its quality. In fact, we are not criticizing science when we are doing meta-research. We are criticizing bad science, and it's quite different. And it's probably better that science will be criticized by scientists rather than by anti-scientists. It is also important to show that scientists, at least some scientists, are taking up seriously the issues of research quality. And it's important to show the general public that we are working hard to do better research. Can meta-research help to fight anti-science? Perhaps. I think that meta-research could help to understand the methods used by anti-scientists to disseminate their position or beliefs, to evaluate intervention to limit the influence of anti-science, and to prevent misinformation. Two examples, a meta-knowledge analysis of the salt controversy performed by Ludovic Trincard in my team. Here you could see the reports that are classified as supportive or contradictory of the hypothesis that salt reduction leads to population benefits. And we have constructed the network of citation connecting these reports. And you could see that there is different types of reports, guidelines, primary studies, systematic reviews, comments, letters. And in blue, you have the supportive. In red, the contradictory, and in yellow, the inconclusive. And as you could see, the supportive are citing the supportive. The contradictory are citing the contradictory. And reports were 1.5 times more likely to cite reports that drew a similar conclusion than to cite reports drawing a different conclusion. And interesting, in fact, people are citing the people who think like them. We have also performed a series of randomized control trials to demonstrate the impact of spin, either on clinicians, but also on patients. Spin has been defined as a specific intentional or unintentional reporting that fails to faithfully reflect the nature and range of findings, and that could affect the impressions the result produced in readers. If you want more details, we have published last week in PNAS a paper on that with Isabelle Boutron. And we have performed several randomized control trials. The last one was about preclinical studies, phase 1 and phase 2 studies, and randomized control trials. And all these trials demonstrated that the spin impact deeply the interpretation of trials of the different studies. And it's true for both clinicians and patients. And my last slide is about neutralizing misinformation through inoculation. It's a paper from the team from John Cook, Stefan Lewandowski, and Ecker. And they are performing trials for inoculating messages that explain the flawed argumentation technique used in the misinformation, or highlight the scientific consensus on climate change. And they demonstrate that this way of doing were effective in neutralizing those adverse effects of misinformation. And they recommend to take into account ways in which scientific content can be distorted, and to include preemptive inoculation messages to neutralize misinformation before it is encoded. And it's a technique that, that is known as pre-bunking. And they have written a book, the Debunking Handbook, that is very interesting. Thank you.